Hello, welcome to the second of our videos on the central nervous system. On this video, we will look more detail of the cerebrum. So this was the part that we usually think of when we think of the brain. Kind of two halves made from wiggly little sausages. In fact, cerebrum, which is made of two hemispheres, so two halves, is the superior part of the brain, and it is the biggest part of it, accounting for 83% of the brain mass. And there are a few surface markings that I want to review with you. The gyri refers to the ridges or bumps, if you wish, while sulci are these grooves or depressions. And finally, fissures are very deep or prominent grooves, and there are two types of these, longitudinal and transverse. Let's have a look of these. So this brain that we see here, a picture of, is as if it were we looking it from the top down. And you can see that the two cerebral hemispheres are separated by this longitudinal fissure. And here we can see a transverse cerebral fissure which separates the cerebrum and cerebellum. Now, what I want us to do is to identify the four major lobes of the brain. They are separated by the major sulci of the cerebrum, and these are on this left lateral view of the brain, the frontal lobe most anteriorly, and then parietal lobe, which is located, surprise, surprise, under the parietal bone of the skull. Then we have the temporal lobe under the temporal bone, and finally the occipital lobe at the back. And although it really is not a lobe, but an area deeper inside between the temporal and frontal lobes, we have insula. I would also like to discuss with you the major sulci and fissures that we can see here. And the longitudinal fissure we already discussed, right? It separated the right and left cerebral hemispheres. The central sulcus separates the frontal and parietal lobes. It is usually very prominent and easily visible on a human brain. Transverse cerebral fissure then again separates the occipital lobe and cerebellum, so our little brain. And lateral sulcus separates the temporal lobe from the rest. And finally, parietal occipital sulcus separates the occipital lobe from the parietal lobe. The reason why I wanted to introduce you to these sulci and fissures is that I wanted to show how they are behind the lobes that we saw earlier. And I think that we will cover the functions of each of these lobes in the next time-lapse video. But before we do, I want to tell you how do we know all these functions and what is located at what brain lobe. And it turns out that in the early days it was our brain injury cases that gave us much of our understanding of the localization of the functions on certain areas of the brain. Like remember Mr. Phineas Gage that we talked about in the last chapter. Here he is with that metal pole that went through his frontal lobe. So the changes in him after this injury gave us some idea about what the frontal lobe of the brain does. And these days, it is brain imaging techniques like the one that you see here that allow us to have a test subject to perform certain kinds of activities while we study what parts of the brain are especially active and light up in the screen when they are performed. In fact, my previous jobs involved a lot of looking at this. Now, before we wrap up this video, I want to briefly show one more thing. And These are two areas that are of a special interest to us, and they are Broca's area, which is especially important in the speech production, and Wernicke's area, which plays a more of a role in the speech comprehension. So that's it for this video. Let's look at the functions of these cerebral lobes that we reviewed earlier. Next, I will see you then.